this woman whom you gave to me. So the man blames God, and then the man blames the woman, and so God goes to the woman, and the woman blames the serpent, and the serpent is not there to blame somebody else or defend his cause. That then moves God to talk about the consequences of them eating of the tree. And the consequences or the curses are in reverse order. So God goes to the man blames the woman blames the serpent, and God then gives the curses to the serpent, and then to the woman, and then to the man, in the reverse order of what we have just seen. I've made a little bit of a mention, and I'll make a little bit more comment here this morning about this idea of curse. Curse throughout the Old Testament is an important concept, and it stands opposed to the idea of blessing, though blessing and curse are not exact opposites. Though sometimes we think of them as polar opposites, they're not exactly opposed to each other. The idea of blessing is when one follows God, God blesses, right? And typically the blessings in the Old Testament have to do with land and with family. And so you think, if I make the decision to follow God, God blesses my crop, so I have a fruitful harvest. God blesses my family, so in the ancient world, patriarchal society, a lot of that would mean having sons that in name and inheritance could pass on to, that would get married and have more sons and grow the family name. Ultimately, that provides a couple of things. Growing the family grows the family's ability to survive if you're growing through male children who then have families. They go out, they harvest the crop, they defend the family from people on the outside, so on and so forth. And it also grows the nation of Israel. So Israel is God's people. Israel has a responsibility to be a light to the world. They have a responsibility to clear the inhabitants from the promised land of Canaan, make it back into kind of like a Garden of Eden that we've talked about. All of that is going to be benefited by the nation of Israel growing. Like the more the nation of Israel grows, the more the people of God grows, theoretically, the more they're able to accomplish God's job for them, to be a light to the world. Now, the problem is Israel grows, kind of. Sometimes there's something that's interesting to consider. When we read the Old Testament and we see God bless the nation of Israel in all of these ways, he gives them this land, they create this kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. That kingdom splits, and you have two kingdoms under a variety of kings, with the southern kingdom of Judah having kings that continue in the line of David and Solomon. Sometimes we read those stories and we're presented with a version of Israel's history that makes them appear like a powerful nation and a very formidable opponent. That was really never true historically. At least from an outside perspective, we know the whole God thing being on their side. But you take that out of the equation, you understand first off that our Old Testament history of Israel is written from Israel's perspective, so they're a little bit biased about how good and wonderful and powerful they actually are. The nation of Israel never got all that large. It did a decent job of protecting itself, but you think about the nation of Israel never really spread. So you think of a powerful empire like Rome or like Babylon or like Persia that conquered pretty much the entire known world and became massive. That was never Israel. Israel was always relatively small and insignificant. What made them significant in world things and why they get conquered and they have these enemies and stuff like that is more because of their location. They're located in a land that has a seaport on one side, that has great places for irrigation and for crops on the other side. And so they're in a good geographical location, which makes them not only land that other nations might want, but land that other nations have to pass through. So you think about if you have a nation that is coming from the north, so Europe, which is ultimately where Rome comes from, and one of the most formidable nations throughout ancient history is Egypt, which is down here. How do you get from Europe to Egypt? Well, you have one of two options. You can go a sea route. If you want to go a land route, you have to pass through the nation of Israel, which sits between Europe and Egypt, which is where most of your world powers, you get some world powers that come from the east. But you think about that in the nation of Israel. And so when Israel is blessed as a nation, their families are blessed and they grow. The nation of Israel is able to grow. They're able to defend themselves, though never really become this great nation. And when Israel fails to follow God, the curses come. So you read through the law, you read through Moses' sermon in Deuteronomy, and there's multiple lists of blessings and curses. You follow God, these blessings will come your way. You fail to follow God, the curses come. And you look at what the curses tend to be. They tend to be a lack of crop, so the crop fails. Family-related things. So you think of, for example, David's whole deal with Bathsheba. The result is that their child dies. So you see a negation of the family. Something that we see in Judges, it's another example. So we looked at Jephthah a week ago, and Jephthah ends up taking the life of or sacrificing his daughter, which is his only child. And the text says multiple times that it's his only child. That's significant because Jephthah's failure to follow God, Jephthah's failure of ethics and morality at the end of the story is sacrificing his daughter. Not only does he lose a daughter, but in losing his only child, he loses the continuation of his family, which is significant. And so if we read behind the text, though this is never stated, we could argue that one of God's curses upon Jephthah for his lack of morality is that Jephthah's family does not get to continue. That's one of the consequences of what Jephthah does. And so when Adam and Eve eat of the tree and the curses come that are the opposite to these blessings, what's interesting is that the same themes continue to appear. So what are the curses on the women? Well, they have to do with childbirth. So the continuation of the family. That still tends to be wrapped up in the curses throughout the rest of the Old Testament. What are the curses on the man? It's going to be more difficult for you to work the ground, which is the curse of crop and sustenance, which continues to be a part of the curses throughout the Old Testament. So the themes that we see here in the curses continue throughout the Old Testament. So you imagine an ancient Israelite reading these texts, and they're thinking to themselves, not only is this a reflection of life as we know it, we know that childbirth is dangerous and difficult, we know that working the ground is not the easiest thing to do, but it also reflects to them these curses that come because of Adam and Eve's choice to do something that God told them not to do, are the same kind of curses that we continue to suffer from when we make similar types of decisions, which Israel did time and time and time again. And I say that because I want us to also be thinking about why Israel tells these stories and preserves these stories. Right? We've talked about oral tradition before. So these stories begin by, in essence, campfire talk. We're telling these stories around the campfire and in our family. Well, what's the purpose of them? Well, they all give identity. They define who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Genesis obviously answers the question, where did we come from? I would also argue it answers the question of where we're going, because what Israel was supposed to do and failed, and what Jesus accomplished is getting us a return back to Eden. But it also explains for Israel where they are. Why are things the way that they are? Not just why is the world broken, but why do we relate to God in the way that we do? And so one of the foundations of blessing and cursing, of obedience versus disobedience, that is core for Israel, that, like I said, Israel consistently fails at, is rooted in the story of the beginning, of where all humanity has come from. We'll talk about that idea of all humanity. Okay, so we spent the last several weeks talking about the serpent. We're not going to get back into the concept of the serpent because I feel like we have talked the serpent to death. Though there's a lot more that I would love to say about the serpent. The main thing that I want to say as we move on, if you take anything from our discussion of the serpent, whatever or whoever you think the serpent is, if you think the serpent is Satan, which is a possibility, not the only possibility, if you think the serpent had legs and then is cursed to slither on the ground after that, which is a possibility, but not the only possibility, that's fine. Whatever you think about, I want us to primarily think about what the serpent represents. So beyond all that, the serpent is a being that stands opposed to God's creative acts. The serpent stands opposed to God's design for the creation. And there are then a multitude of different things that can continue to fill that role of serpent. We mentioned Satan would be one of them, principalities and powers that Paul talks about in Ephesians, ourselves, our own desires, all fit into this concept of the role that the serpent fills. And that's the way that I want us to think about serpent, and then think about what Jesus does in relation to the serpent. Jesus conquers the powers of evil in the world and defeats the serpent, though in a much wider way than just a defeat of Satan or a forgiving of my individual sin or whatever, though all of that is part of it. But it's part of this larger story of Jesus defeating evil as a whole. All right, with that being said, let's move on. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16. So verses 14 and 15, Jesus addresses the serpent. In verse 16, God turns to address the woman. To the woman, he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. One thing that I want us to think about with the curses of both the man and the woman is that they are a reversal of the royal vocation given to humanity. Human beings were created in the image of God. We've talked about how that is a royal designation. God is king, and those in the image of the king stand in the place of the king and rule on behalf of the king. And so the job of the man and the woman were to rule God's creation on behalf of God the king. And that meant that they were to be fruitful, and they were to multiply, and they were to fill the earth, and they were to rule over it. And what we see here in Genesis 3 is a reversal of that. So we talked about how being deceived by the serpent is not just being deceived by evil, however we want to think about evil, conceptualize that idea. But it is Adam and Eve, rather than ruling over the creation, they are ruled by it. And so we get a reversal of God's vocation that he had given to the man and the woman. And we see that here with the woman. So the first thing is that God says that he will greatly increase her pains in childbearing. Childbearing, which is not merely essential to the continuation of the human race. So you can think about, on the one hand, God is saying your pain is going to be increased in something that is natural, something that is necessary for the continuation of family, continuation of the human race. But as I said, it is also, childbearing is a fulfillment of humanity's royal vocation to be fruitful and multiply. What are the man and the woman supposed to do? To complete the reason that God created them, particularly the reason God created them in his image. They are to be fruitful, and they are to multiply, and they are to fill the earth, which is now not going to be the easiest thing to do. In doing so, when they fill the earth, they are to rule over it. And ruling over, or stewarding, or caring for the creation is much easier with a larger family. So you go to the life of Israel as a whole later on, and you see the larger your family, yes, it means the more food that you need to provide for the family. So there's a positive and negative there. There's a balance that ancient families had to have. But it also becomes easier to go out and work the field. Right? So let's say I, as one person, can work the field and provide enough food for 2 people. So now I have 4 sons, and there's now 6 of us in the family. 5 of us are out working in the field. We're all producing food for 2. Now we have enough food for 10 people. So you see kind of that balancing act that an ancient family would have to have. My point being, working the fields, caring for God's creation, ruling over it, is something that would become easier as Adam and Eve's family grew and multiplied. As they fulfilled the job of being fruitful and multiplying, they're better able to fill the job of filling the earth and ruling over it. It's not something that just Adam and Eve were meant to do, or that they could merely do. And so, in this reversal, not only is it going to be more difficult for them to fill the job to be fruitful and multiply, it's also going to be more difficult for them to fill the role of filling the earth and ruling over it. Now, this brings the interesting question of, does this mean that there was no pain to childbirth before this moment, which is normally what we assume? And I feel like I've said this a million times in Genesis. That is a perfectly fine way to interpret this passage, but I'm going to give an alternative reading. Because I think there's more than one way to read and understand this passage. On the one hand, we can think in our minds, we can use our imaginations to think, okay, world before sin, before evil, the job of human beings to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We can imagine the possibility of this being a time where childbirth was a lot easier of a process than it became afterwards. That childbearing was not a painful process, that the pain came as a result of the fall. It's a perfectly fine way to understand this passage. We can also use our imagination to think, well, biologically, maybe that's a hard thing for us to imagine. That just the way that God designed female bodies, thinking of, could there ever have been a time where that was not painful? And that's a very good way to think about it as well. Of maybe there wasn't ever a time where the process was painless. And so, if that's the way we wanted to read it, then we think about God increasing the pain and what that might look like if we're not going from painless to painful, but an increasing of pain. If that's the case, I want to provide a possible way to read this. The increased pain may not be a reference to an increase of physical pain that wasn't there and is now there, but could rather be talking about increased pain of motherhood. That is the increased pain of raising a child, such as having to deal with a son killing another son, which is the very next story that we get. we see the pain of motherhood 10 verses from now, or something like that, that we know and is meant to show the result of sin. What does sin do? Well, it quickly moves from eating of a tree in Genesis 3, which is a relatively light offense in the grand scheme of things. It moves from eating of a tree to murder in the very next chapter, which is a very high escalation of sin. And the rest of Genesis 1 through 11 show how humanity continues to get worse and worse and worse. So a brother kills a brother, and then there's nobody good left on the planet, so God has to restart with Noah. And then Noah gets drunk, and one of his sons does some heinous acts to him while he's drunk and passed out and naked in his tent. So the restarting didn't go very well. And then humanity tries to build a tower up to the heavens, and God has to confuse their language. And then in Genesis 12, God calls Abraham, and he's like, okay, let's start the process of solving all of this. So we see the downward spiral of sin. And I say that just to say that an alternative reading of this first curse upon the woman might not be a relation to physical pain, going from nothing to something, but that there's an increased pain in this process of being fruitful and multiplying. Because now, in creating and sustaining these families, the role of motherhood is no longer going to be very easy because of the existence of sin in the world. And now you can even set that into the context of an ancient Israelite society where they had, I guess, what we would call traditional roles in the family. The husband's job was to protect the family and go out and work in the fields. The wife's job was typically, though wives were involved in that process, it wasn't a drastic separation of roles. But a wife would be a little bit more responsible in raising children than the father might be, and that role is going to become more and more difficult, like I said, with perhaps a brother killing a brother. This greater pain in childbearing is also mirrored by the greater number that humanity was supposed to have. So humanity was supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and now God is multiplying the pain that's related to the process of being fruitful and multiplying. So again, you have the reversal of God's intention for the man and the woman. The second curse is that the woman's husband is going to rule over her. So we go back to the creation of the man and the woman, and we remember that they were created out of and to be one flesh. So the woman was created from the flesh of man, and so they were meant to be united together once again as one flesh. When we talked about that passage, we talked about how there is an equality that is meant to exist between them so that together they can rule over God's creation. So when we talked about that God looks at the man and he sees that the man is lonely. He needs a helper fit for him, or a helper like opposite him would be a literal translation there. And we talked about how the idea there is God has created this garden. He's put the man in the garden. The man is supposed to work the garden, but God's watching the man working the garden and realizes that he needs a helper to work the garden. So the idea of alone is not the man got lonely. It was that the man was alone to work the garden, and God saw that and said, well, that's a problem. He needs somebody to help him do this job that I have given to him. Which is why I argue that the first thing that God does is he passes the animals in front of Adam. Because an animal is helpful in caring for a garden. Right? You think about the agricultural world of ancient Israel, and you would use an ox to help to plow the field. So the concept of an animal as a helper is logical in that instinct. Because sometimes we read that passage and we think, okay, Adam is lonely and he needs a wife, And the first thing that God does is try to find him a wife among the animals, which makes absolutely no sense. And we're left to say, well, God just did that to make Adam realize that he couldn't find a wife among the animals. And I don't know about you, but that makes God out to be even more crazy than the first option of actually thinking that he could find a wife with the animals. And so I like the interpretation more of the problem is that Adam needs someone to work the ground with. And so God presents him with the animals, which would be a good, possible, logical solution to his problem. But among the animals, there was not a helper that was like opposite him, that could connect with him and help him rule in the correct way. So what does God need to do? He needs to create a woman who is from Adam, but different than Adam, that like opposite idea, and together you get the perfect pair that's able to go and rule over God's creation.
Just one statement. In listening to you, I was giving, your examples were like you were allowing your mind to wander through the scripture to see what possibly could be or what might be. When you got to the animals, I realized that's not for me. I'm going to stick strictly with word for word because I didn't want that picture in my head.
Yeah, it's a, my point is kind of, it's a very weird thing that's going on there.
Yeah.
Right? So that's God's intention for the man and the woman. And now, though, with these curses, there will be a problem with this relationship. Right? So there's these two equal beings that are meant to rule over God's creation, to care for that garden together. But now there's going to be a problem because the man will rule over the woman, which is evidenced, I think, obviously, by the patriarchal constructs throughout human history, which is interesting because when an Israelite read this in the way that their society was set up, Genesis 1 through 3 should have stood as a critique of the way that Israelite society was set up, because it was set up to mirror more the fall in Genesis 3 than the creation in Genesis 1 and 2, which was a problem because, you remember I said in Genesis 2 we have all these rivers with the garden that make absolutely no sense, that there's not like a plot of land that fits this description of the rivers. And so once again, I argued that maybe the best way to read that is not that these rivers are trying to identify a specific location, but that these were the rivers that were around Israel. They were around the promised land. They were rivers that an Israelite would have known. So an Israelite reading that might not have thought, oh, this was the land that perfectly fits around these rivers, but these are the rivers that sit around our land. If that's the case, then you could make the argument that Israel was supposed to interpret the promised land as the land of Eden. That Adam and Eve were kicked out as the sinful and brokenness comes into the world, and through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, ultimately Moses and Joshua, God brings a chosen group of people back to where it all began, tells them to drive out the people that are currently in the land so that the promised land could be returned to Eden status. That Israel, by living out their job as the people of God, would return the promised land to Eden. And then that's where you get the promises of the mountain, Mount Zion. So the Temple Mount, God's dwelling place, in the middle of this reestablished garden, then draws all of humanity back into the presence of God. Though Israel obviously never gets close to doing that, and Judges that I'm preaching through is the perfect example, because they never actually get the inhabitants out. And so they can't ever start the project of renewing the garden. And so Jesus has to come as the embodiment of all of Israel, where Jesus succeeds, where the entire nation of Israel failed, and through Jesus we get the hope of new heavens and a new earth, which again is a return to Eden, returning us to the language of Genesis. And so when an Israelite, if I'm correct in everything that I just said, which I may be correct in none of what I just said, but if I'm correct in what I just said, then an Israelite reading this, it should stand to them as a warning, as a statement to live and construct their society in a way that is reflective of God's intention, not a reflection of the fall, because that's what Israel is supposed to do. And that would also mean, you remember God's problem with the other nations, and don't be like them. So like Jephthah last week, we talked about the other nations engaged in child sacrifice, and God told the Israelites, you don't worship me like they do, because they do these abominable acts, which is the very thing that Jephthah ends up doing. The other nations might be established in this patriarchal, male-dominated way, and God would almost say, that's fine, because that's the way the fallen world works. That's what sin does. But you, Israel, are meant to look different, and by looking different, you draw the world out of the world and to the Temple Mount, to the dwelling place of God, and that ends up spreading to the world, and now Israel is being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth and ruling over it, which was God's intention for Adam and Eve, that Israel could then go on and do. But if I've said it once, I've said it a million times, Israel epically fails at doing that. Now, here's something else that's interesting, and maybe complicates things a little bit on how we are to determine your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So the way that poetic lines work is those two lines mirror each other. So they mean the same thing, it's said in two different ways. So the meaning of the woman having desire for her husband is equivalent to the idea of the husband ruling over her. These are the same ideas expressed in two different ways. So however we interpret it, there has to be some harmony there. That term desire throughout the Old Testament tends to, though it doesn't always have to mean this, but it tends to have sexual overtones. Your desire for your spouse, or let's think of negative stories. David's desire for Bathsheba, or we're going to talk about Samson this morning. Samson's desire for Delilah. It's sexual in nature. It's not just that you want them to eat dinner with you or something like that. It's much deeper than that. And so a possible way to interpret this is less patriarchal structures in general, and maybe more patriarchal structures and desires and abuse within the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. And that also becomes evident in Israel. So I gave the example of David, and I want to go back to David. That you think of David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba is desirable for David. David sees her bathing on the rooftop. Bathing on a rooftop was a normal practice. Bathsheba's doing nothing wrong there. My question is, why is David on his rooftop looking down at the other rooftops when he knows good and well what people do on their rooftops? I've got a lot of questions for David. David decides that he wants Bathsheba. And when you're a king gets what the king wants. You notice you read through that story, we are never presented the desires of Bathsheba. And so the best interpretation of that story is that Bathsheba likely did not want to have anything to do with what ends up coming about. David forces that upon her. That entire thing would be, in essence, what's being talked about here. Your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. That's kind of what David does to Bathsheba, and then we continue something else that's interesting. I mentioned they lose their first child, so that connection to curse and the continuation of the family. And we get this.
That the man, like David, forces himself back.
Yes.
And that's
So
what this scripture says.
So if we read the idea of desire as not just general desire, but specifically sexual desire, then what it's saying is that there's this friction between the relationship is sometimes going to express itself in the way it does in a story like David and Bathsheba, where David forces himself upon her without her consent, without her desire, without whatever, because David is king. David gets to do what David wants to do. In wider society, this would have been true within Israel and with all kinds of societies. Generally, that was the man's prerogative, so his wife was his property. His children were his property, his animals were his property. That gives the man the right to do whatever, whenever, to wife, children, animals, grain, whatever. It was all the man's property. And if you think about it in that context, which we don't have to, though that would be at least a part of a subsection of, if not the primary point here. But you think of the then give and pull of this idea of desire and rule. So if any of you have ever known or studied what takes place within abusive relationships. So if a man and a woman are married, and the man is abusive to his wife, generally, there are exceptions to this, but generally, it takes a long period of time, if ever, for the wife to leave the abusive situation. And a lot of the times for people who've never experienced that, they wonder, well, why didn't you leave earlier? And the reason for that, without diving too deep into the psychology of how that works, the reason for that is the push and pull of desire and being ruled over. Right? A lot of the times when that happens, a man and a woman get married because of their desire for each other. They deeply love each other. And from the beginning, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not abusive. That happens over time. And then you have this push and pull of being ruled over, being treated in a way that I shouldn't be, but also my desire for this person and their desire for me, though it's being expressed in an abusive and harmful kind of way. And those dynamics play a role into what happens with those who live within abusive relationships. And you see that, again, that's played out time and time again in the Old Testament. So David and Bathsheba is an example. Tamar and Judah's sons is another example of how that might play out. And the point here being, however we want to interpret that, is that this relationship between the man and the woman that was intended to be an relationship of equality, of one fleshness, to together fulfill God's call to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. That relationship that was meant to be the core of living out that vocation is going to be filled with all kinds of problems. Not only is the actual process of creating and sustaining families going to be filled with evil and sin, but the relationship between a husband and a wife is going to be filled with evil and sin to various degrees. And the history of Israel ends up proving that time and time again. I'm completely out of time. So I want us to have some discussion on this next week, but something else to even think about is the stories in Judges. Last two we looked at we've looked at Abimelech, we've looked at Jephthah, both of whom were illegitimate children because of their father's relationship with a concubine in regards to Abimelech and a prostitute in regards to Jephthah, would be another example of what is being talked about here in Genesis chapter 3. That's a result of the fall. All of that. And you see what happens when the father uses his authority in the way that he does. We get Abimelech and Jephthah, who then rise to authority because of similar sinful desires. And the end of that story, both of those stories, is terrible. 70 brothers get killed, a virgin daughter gets sacrificed, and you play that back, and eventually we get back to Genesis chapter 3. And what God said would be the result of sin, and what Israel is meant to do the opposite of, and doesn't. Long story short, just about everything that Israel messes up, we can trace it back to them not understanding Genesis 1 through 3. I'm out of time. I do want to have a little bit of discussion on that, and then we'll move on to the man next week, and at some point we'll finish up Genesis chapter 3.